Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Med Talks on Awaz 103.1 Pendle FM. It's the 9th of June, 2020. It's Tuesday night. It's 8 till 9. Welcome to the show. My name is Fahim Shakur, and along with my lovely co-host, Mehran Javed, we host this show every Tuesday night, 8 till 9 on Awaz FM. Before we go into the guest, who my friend Mehran will go into, the topic of tonight's discussion is something quite sobering, domestic violence, but also quite important with regards to the lockdown and the actual effect it's had. Some of the issues may be of an adult nature that we discussed this evening, and so if you have a sensitive disposition, you may not wish to listen to all of the information that's being said. However, having said that, if any of the information tonight is pertinent or relevant to you or a loved one, then this is the hotline number that I want you to make a note of: 0808 2000 247. I repeat, 0808 2000 247. That's a 24-hour National Domestic Abuse Helpline. Over to you, Mehran.
Thank you, Fahim, and welcome everybody for another show of Med Talks, being broadcasted live on YouTube as well as Pendle Community Radio, Awaz 103.1 FM. So a bit of introduction to our two guests. I will start with Holly. So Holly Atkins is a family law solicitor at Slater and Gordon. She works on a range of cases, including marriage and relationship breakdowns, as well as domestic violence. She is also a member of Resolution, a community of legal professionals who aim to resolve family law cases in an amicable, constructive manner. She does have a firm belief that this method helps to produce good outcomes for couples that perhaps have separated, as well as their children. So thank you so much, Holly, for joining us.
Thank you for having me. Thank you very much.
And of course, our next guest is Shigufta Khan. She is the CEO of the Wish Centre, which was actually set up back in 1988, and two up, two down kind of terraced house in Blackburn. Is that correct, Shigufta?
It is correct, yes.
And just, I guess, a little bit about yourself. You have two children, a boy and a girl, both adults working, but you also do appear on the radio yourself. But clearly, domestic violence is a key area of interest for yourself, as well as honour-based violence, as well as female genital mutilation, both regionally as well as nationally.
They are. So I came into this area of work in 2007, and it's something that just hooked me when I first came into this, because I think the difference that you make in people's lives, that you see the difference that you make on a daily basis, just keeps you really connected. So it's fascinating area of work. As you said, Mehran, we set up in 1988 by a group of women because there wasn't a refuge or any safety, a place of safety for them. And we've grown over the years, and we have 2 refuges now, 5 houses, 9 flats, and a community base in Blackburn, near the town centre. So we're really proud of the service that we offer, and it's very much needed.
Fantastic. So Shigufta, if I start with yourself, domestic violence, what do people understand by that terminology?
I think a lot of people have that misconception that domestic violence is physical abuse. So I think people assume that if you're not being physically abused, you're not suffering domestic violence. However, we know that domestic violence is much bigger than just physical abuse. So we see victims who have suffered coercive control, who have suffered financial abuse, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, and increasingly we're seeing a lot of stalking and harassment cases. Domestic abuse encompasses much more than just physical abuse, and I think that sort of misconception stops a lot of victims reaching out and getting help and support.
And Holly, over to you. From a legal standpoint, what can you say about domestic violence?
So I completely agree with everything Shigufta said. A lot of the time people assume domestic violence is physical harm, but actually more often than not, kind of in a legal sense, we come across the coercive control, economic abuse, online abuse, emotional abuse. So coercive control in particular is when the abuser uses a pattern of behaviour over a period of time, and they're doing it to exert power and control on their victim. It doesn't leave any marks and scars physically, but emotionally it causes the victim to experience fear, loss of freedom, and that sort of thing on a daily basis. Particularly also at the moment during lockdown, we're seeing a lot of people using domestic violence through the internet. So, people can use social media to cause distress to their victims. They can control people's phones. So, if you're living with somebody, they might be checking your phone every day or reading your messages. This is all domestic abuse as well. And don't necessarily always realise that and realise they need to seek help. Or perhaps they don't realise that their friends or family are going through it because they can't see what's going on behind closed doors, and they're not leaving the home with marks or bruises. So it's a really difficult time.
Holly, I just want to go a little bit into your background, just for the listeners and viewers. You're obviously a family lawyer, a solicitor. Can you tell us the range of workload that someone of that description does, just for people who might not be familiar with that?
So I'm a private family law solicitor. So generally I deal with divorces and separation, but then everything that comes from that. So you might be sorting out children arrangements, you might be sorting out division of assets, whether it's properties, pensions, but then also domestic violence and helping people who need legal protection from their abuser. So there are a couple of injunctions that you can apply for as a victim of domestic violence to protect yourself. So as well as having help from police and charities, you can come to a solicitor and apply for, there's two different ones. So the first one is a non-molestation order. And essentially what that is it's an injunction putting in place to protect yourself from the abuser, from that abuse ever taking place again. And if they breach that, it's a criminal offence. They can be arrested and they can go up to prison for 5 years. But the way these apply is you have to have been an associated party. So you don't necessarily have to have been married. You can have been living together. You might have a child together. You might be relatives. They might have been civil partners, or even just sort of an intimate relationship for a certain amount of time. But the order prevents them from threatening them, any sort of physical harm, but also encouraging other people to threaten them or use any sort of harm. And that includes things like things through online or through the internet. So kind of as a family lawyer, we deal with all sorts of domestic relations and the difficulties that we see arise from that.
Okay. And you briefly mentioned, I think, non-molestation order. There's also an occupation order. Is that right, Holly? Could you tell a little bit about that?
Occupation is the other one, which essentially it's when you've got a home or somewhere that the couple have been living, or whoever it is the parties might have been living. If you're at risk of harm, it might be important to exclude the other person from being in the property. So you don't necessarily have to leave the property and go and find shelter elsewhere, which a lot of people think they do. They might think, I've got nowhere else to go. I'll end up homeless. It's the middle of lockdown. But if there's domestic violence going on, you are allowed to leave your home for domestic violence reasons. That is not against the law. And two, it might be worth, you can get the other person, so your spouse or the other person from your property, excluded, so they're not allowed to enter the property. And if they do, you can phone the police and they'll be arrested. Again, it can be a criminal offence. Or they might not be allowed to come within a certain distance. They might not be allowed within 100 metres of the property. So this is another way of protecting yourself. So somebody can't come near you, they can't threaten you, they can't cause violence. So it just gives you that level of protection, and you're able to, that removes the stress and the fear that people go through. So these are really, really important orders that we see people applying for every day.
So when we talk about definition, just going back to that, there was actually, from my understanding, there's no legal definition, is there? But I guess the government have implied that it involves anyone aged 16 or over. Previously, it used to be 18, but I think they've reduced that down recently to 16. So that's meant that lots of the child and adolescent services have had to also be involved because they may be victim or being the abuser in such cases. So as you both alluded to, there's many different types, whether it's psychological, physical, financial, emotional, and it's the scarring that it leaves, and especially with the current circumstance with lockdown secondary to coronavirus, it's obviously made a huge impact. I don't know, Shigufta, whether you've had a difference in the form of referrals you've received or the kind of care provision you've had to provide, because I guess you've had to think quite laterally with the support services in the community, isn't it?
We have had to, because obviously when lockdown happened, our biggest fear was that how will victims be able to access help and support, especially the ones that are living with their partners, their abusers. So if the victims were living separately, then that's a different scenario. But if you're living with your abuser, it's basically abusers. It's what they want anyway. They want to control you and exclude you from getting help and support. And this has almost happened to them. It's been handed to them on their lap, if you will. So we were very, very anxious about this and worried about this. And in the first 2 weeks of lockdown, we saw a significant drop in the referrals that were coming in, which highlighted to us that this was a real area of concern. Referrals have changed now, so people are coming through and contacting help and support. But one of the things that we did was we launched an online service. So we linked it to our website, and it was an online chat service. And that was one of the ideas, was that if you had access to a smartphone or an internet for a short period of time, maybe you could access help and support online if you can't ring and safely talk to somebody. So that was one of the things that we did. And also we've put a lot of information out there on social media about safety planning, about how to get help and support, what's important, what you should be doing. And we're constantly updating those resources and sort of putting them on our Facebook page, our Twitter page, and on our website. And the services locally, so Blackburn and Darwin, for example, Lancashire County Council as well, are supporting domestic abuse services locally to sort of get that message out there. And before we came on the radio and we were chatting, Holly mentioned about seeing a sign up at Sainsbury's, sort of highlighting that if you are a victim, come inside and talk to a member of staff. And a lot of stores have done the similar thing. So Boots, Superdrugs, Spars, they've all sort of come on board with this. And they've all got posters and leaflets, and staff have been made aware that somebody might be able to come into the store, because traditionally people went to who were suffering domestic abuse, maybe to their GP, maybe they went to a children's centre, they went to the town hall and spoke to somebody there. They could access help and support in so many different ways because services were open. Going to the school, for example, and asking somebody in the school, the teacher, for help. But all those services are working very differently now. And so that connection with people just isn't there for a victim. So basically, it's about looking at different avenues and how we can help and support them in a different way. So it's not just ourselves as a service. We have obviously engaged with it, but also other services have really thought outside the box. How can we help victims and what can we do? And police have been fantastic with it as well. They've sort of really pushed their domestic abuse campaign, raising awareness on their social media pages. So if you look at Lancashire Police's social media page, you'll see a lot of literature on domestic abuse and highlighting different services that are operating in Lancashire. So I think it's a collective effort, which has been really, really fantastic to see.
Excellent, Shigufta. And Holly, can you give us some sort of examples of cases that you come across, obviously anonymized, but just to get a general gist and flavor so the audience can actually understand what kind of cases arrive at your desk?
Yeah, of course. So just going back to something that Mehran said before, there is no legal definition of domestic abuse or molestation for these non-molestation orders. And the reason is to make sure that there's no loophole for the abuser, so that if they commit the crime, they can't say, oh, well, it doesn't quite come under this word or this wording. It's left broad to allow the victims to because it's so broad, there are so many different types. But in terms of what we're seeing at the moment, I'm particularly seeing an awful lot of, as I mentioned before, abuse that's done through mobile phones and through the internet and things like that, as a way to further isolate people. So it makes, it's a certain level of control that takes away anyone's ability to pick up the phone and call a family member or message a family member and say they need help. And other forms we're seeing are, recently I've seen one where someone's used social media. They've already separated, but they're using social media to basically criticize and publicize and basically air their dirty laundry and cause a lot of distress for their ex-partner. And it's very, very difficult because there is very little you can do. You can see these things coming up on your social media or whatever it is online. You can report it to, it might be Facebook or whoever, but they're not going to act on it straight away. That stuff's there. You might try and phone the police, but you're unlikely to get an instant reaction from them, and you can try and get it taken down, but that's already been put up. But if you get one of these, a non-molestation order in place, the moment somebody breaches that, you can call the police and have them arrested straight away. So it makes it a lot more serious, and the police take it really, really seriously. Other forms we do see are the coercive control. We see an awful lot of, and the problem with that, the problem with proving it, is obviously it's words. It's he said this, she said that, and it's the way it's said. So victims sometimes feel they can't prove it, and they are really, really worried that, he's been saying little things for many, many years, but it builds up to be a massive problem, and it really, it can really knock someone's confidence and take away their ability to speak for themselves and think about what they want and what's right. And it's not until they start talking about it with somebody else that someone can say, that's not right, that's not okay. For a long time you're being controlled. They may be gaslighting you, or they're preventing you from having freedom of expression or belief in yourself, to a point where you think that, I'm imagining it, these things aren't real. So domestic violence, domestic abuse is just so broad, but the important thing is that people speak out if they do think they are experiencing it, even in the slightest, and get someone's help. I've seen as well, going off what Shigufta was saying about it being in supermarkets and charities and police stations advertising it. The government's doing a really good national campaign at the moment. I think because they realised that domestic abuse victims would essentially be like the silent victims with lockdown, because they are the ones at home trapped. But the campaign from the government, the hashtag is "You Are Not Alone." And the idea behind that is just to promote the fact that victims of domestic violence can leave the home, need to be seeking help still. There are so many services that are still running. Solicitors are still working every single day. They are always on the end of the phone. The police are still working. Charities have now got all these online formats and forums where you can speak to people and get help. Yeah.
No, that's great. And I must add that there's lots of feedback coming through our Facebook channel. So there's a quick message from Abdul Razak just saying that it's a very important conversation, and of course there's another from Tausif saying just a great discussion. So it's great to have that kind of audience, and please continue to add comments and supporters on this journey, because it's this, as well as the others, as well as the future projects, that we feel these are quite key, and it's we're grateful for Holly and Shigufta to spare their time. Holly, the cases that you have to deal with, there's obviously a direct communication, and it becomes quite clear when the police need to be involved. What other services do you have to work in conjunction with, just to make sure, because I guess communication is very paramount, isn't it, in terms of managing individual cases?
When people come to us for an initial discussion, they sometimes don't know whether they can contact the police or not. They don't know whether their case is serious enough, or who exactly to help them. So that initial conversation that we have with people opens all the doors. So we initially have that conversation, we work out what the risk is, how serious the issues are, and we will always say to them, if it's immediate danger and there's a real risk, straight away, phone the police straight away, or we can phone the police on their behalf if we think they need it. But we do work in conjunction with a lot of charities. So I'm specifically based in the Manchester office, but we have access to a lot of charities that we recommend to clients every single day, whether it's sort of for victims of abuse or mental health or any sort of support that they might need. I will always refer clients onto that, because as a solicitor, I can't provide the level of emotional support that these people need. I can provide the legal protection, but I can't necessarily provide them with the counselling that they need. So we always work in conjunction with people that can assist in that way, and I will always send them details or get people to call them up if they need the help that way.
Okay, Shigufta, I want to bring you in there. I think Holly brings you in quite nicely there, saying she can provide the legal support, but obviously with your domestic violence charity, you can provide other practical support. And I know you've done teaching and training in this area across the country as well. Can you tell us a little bit about those both things, the support you provide practically through your organization, and how we can actually use some of your training tonight to actually spot these abusers?
Okay, so the support that we provide is very similar to other charities. So we provide support to victims. So it could be a crisis call through our helpline. So somebody could just ring us and say, or ring the national helpline and be directed to us and ask us for help and support, that this is what my situation is. What are my options? What do I do now? And we can talk them through what those options are. And sometimes victims just want that advice initially. They want to dip their toe in the water and say, what will actually happen to me if I ring the police? What will actually happen to me if I leave my house? What will actually happen to me if I don't leave my house and I want to get him out of the house or her out of the house? So we can talk about all those options with them and do that as many times as that victim needs. So sometimes victims will engage with us on a number of occasions before they even take that step to actually leave that relationship. Other times they ring us at the point of crisis. So they have just, high risk incidents happened, maybe something very significant, very serious, and they need immediate help now. Often we get referrals from the police. So it's not a referral from a helpline or a direct referral from a victim. It will come through a police incident. So we will get all the police logs coming to us on a daily basis through a secure email, and then we make contact with the victim after the incident's happened and say, we believe an incident happened last night. Do you want to talk about it? How can we give you help and support? This is who we are. This is what we can provide you with. So it's different scenarios, really, depending if they come to us or the case is referred to us. And we can give them a variety of different options. So that's the victim side of it, whether they want to go to refuge or we can direct them to a solicitor and help them in that way. We also do a lot of work with perpetrators, and we started working with perpetrators many years ago now. And part of the reason why we started doing that was because what we were seeing was that we would have one victim that we moved on from a relationship, and another victim would come through with the same perpetrator, and then another victim would come through with the same perpetrator. So we were firefighting effectively. That's what we were doing, is patching up people and moving them on. But the crux of the issue was the person that was causing the abuse. So we developed a program, and it's been running now for many years. And that program basically is about changing behavior. So for the perpetrator to recognize what is abuse, where that's stemming from, and how to make a change to their lives, basically. And that's been really, really successful. So we run the program in Blackburn and Darwin, and we also run it in Lancashire. So it's delivered in Preston, Lancaster, in Burnley, Nelson, etc. And then we do a lot of work with children, because children are often the hidden victims of domestic abuse, and often both parties will feel that the child isn't there, hasn't seen anything, hasn't heard anything, they're upstairs in bed. But we know that children, who had an argument with your partner, the child will pick up that atmosphere, even if they were not in the room, they would pick it up because there's a tension, there's a stress in the air, there's a change in the environment. So the children will pick it up. And obviously the damage that causes to a child's emotional and mental well-being is significant over a period of time. So a lot of our work is building resilience in children and doing some very focused work. So we start working with children from the age of 6 and work with teenagers up to the age of 18. And there's a different programs that we offer for young people. But going back to the training of it and raising awareness, that's another arm of our service, because we alone cannot work with domestic abuse. It's not just our role or our job to support victims, perpetrators and children. So we need to work alongside children's services, alongside housing officers, alongside health professionals, schools, education. So part of our work is training. So there's a safeguarding board in every area. And we sort of commit to that safeguarding board that we will offer so many training sessions throughout the year. And our sessions are obviously on domestic abuse, forced marriage, honour-based abuse, those sort of things. And so we deliver those sessions in Blackburn, and now we're dealing them in Lancashire as well. And then often I've been called into other parts of the country to deliver sessions. So that's obviously really, really important as well. But for me, locally, it's about raising awareness. So the people that we are signposting to, as Holly referred to before, they're aware of what domestic abuse is. So when we refer to a mental health practitioner, they understand what that crux issue of that domestic abuse victim is, because they've been trained on domestic abuse. So I think that's really, really quite significant and quite important, the training alongside the actual practical support that we offer.
Okay.
Have I talked too much there?
No.
We're just taking it all in. I think there's, unfortunately, the issue of domestic violence, obviously we're talking about it now because it's important, but there's lots of media coverage just stating that, are we failing these individuals who find themselves in these kind of circumstances? Holly, when someone wants legal representation, especially given the current, lockdown restrictions, how do you do the assessment, and how do you do the practical, whether they're able to fund their ongoing care, or whether they need legal aid, because there are some cases where they've been refused legal aid even though they've been on universal credit, which means in essence they would qualify.
Yeah, so if they are a victim of domestic violence, they should be entitled to legal aid. It does also take into account their means. I think it's means tested. So it does depend on their income, but I think if there's domestic violence generally, they should be entitled to legal aid from the very, very start. And then in terms of kind of the way it works, most solicitors are all set up to work from home now. Everything's being done by telephone or video call. So it's quite easy to have those initial consultations, and then all the court hearings are being done remotely as well. So there shouldn't be any delays in getting these things seen to. They are being prioritised by the courts. If you make an urgent application for protection, it will be dealt with very, very quickly. The court's hearings are taking place on telephone. So what would happen if you made an application and you came to someone, whether it's via legal aid or privately funded, your solicitor would help you in creating a statement. So you would fill out the application for what you're looking for, and you provide a statement setting out exactly what's happened, and you might try and give evidence if you've got any photographs or screenshots or anything like that, and you submit those to the court as an urgent application, and it will be dealt with within a matter of hours, if not days, if not hours. And the court would decide whether it's serious enough that the order needs to be granted immediately. Generally, the perpetrator of domestic violence won't get legal aid. So we do also frequently act for them, and we assist them when these proceedings are ongoing to advise them in terms of what their rights are, what domestic violence is, explain that to them. We can also signpost them on, as we were saying earlier, onto charities that can assist in kind of educating them in what domestic violence is. There are certainly a lot of perpetrator programs out there to assist people in understanding how these things work. And another thing that I thought was interesting, we mentioned earlier, is the fact that children are the silent victims in all of this. They're kind of the victims. So it's not just domestic violence that maybe the mother and father, children do suffer as well. And I'm seeing a lot of applications at the moment for children matters, and a lot of phone calls about where the children are staying in the house, or perhaps you've got separated parents living in separate properties. There's been a lot of discussions at the moment in terms of which house should that child be in, where are they safest, can they be moved safely between properties? Sorry, I've gone off on a bit of a tangent here. But it's, the government have made very, very clear that children under 18 can be moved between properties so long as it's safe to do so. But if someone has a child and they think they're perhaps not safe with the other parent, they can make an application to court as well for something called a child arrangements order. And a child arrangement order, basically, it's like custody and residency. It determines where the child lives, who they spend time with, how that contact takes place. Is it direct? So are they going around to the house? Are they having overnight stays with the other parent? Or is it just indirect by FaceTime or telephone, because that's the safer way to do it? And we're seeing a lot of these applications at the moment where perhaps one parent thinks, you know what, my child's not safe with the other parent. I don't feel safe with the other parent. We're in a different property now, and I'd like to go through the court procedure, get something in place in a court order that is legally binding, it's enforceable, that protects both myself and my child, and means we don't have to go to that person's house or spend time with them and be at risk.
Shigufta, I want to bring you back in. In terms of domestic violence, I think the audience has realized that obviously it can affect anyone regardless of their background. Having said that, though, poverty can be a factor, your ethnic origin perhaps, learning disabilities, and other things of that nature. Can you give us a little bit about the social and cultural context in which it feeds into your foundation and your charity?
So you're right, absolutely, Fahim. So if somebody is vulnerable because of disabilities, learning disabilities or physical disabilities, or they have a caring need, then those people obviously can be targeted by people who are perpetrating abuse. And because of their vulnerability, that just makes it more difficult, really, for them to access help and support. So we do see cases like that. And obviously we work with services, adult services usually, to provide help and support in those situations. And that's really important to remember, that often the carer can be the abuser. And if a carer is doing all the talking, it's very difficult for that victim to reach out and access help and support. So that's one aspect of it. But also what we see is victims from all walks of life, and alcohol use or poverty can certainly escalate and be a factor in domestic abuse. But ultimately, domestic abuse is a pattern of behaviour. It's one person wanting control and power over another person, and that, I think, it's interesting, really, because there are preconceptions that people have, and unconscious bias almost, that all these sort of people will be suffering domestic abuse, and maybe people with education or good jobs will not be suffering domestic abuse. But in fact, we see people from all walks of life. We've seen professionals, practitioners who have suffered domestic abuse, and often they are very reluctant to access help and support because of the publicity that causes them, I suppose, and people knowing about their personal business. So they are often suffering for a much longer period of time before they can sort of tap into services. And if you think about, if you were living in your own property and you had a mortgage or the property was paid for, your children went to a nice school, you lived in a nice area, and you suffered domestic abuse, so you've got more barriers in place in access to help and support and leaving that situation, then maybe if you were not living in that sort of scenario. So I think it's interesting, and certainly when you see the cases that come through, I always find it. I always think to myself when I look at those cases that people who are happy to access help and support, who are open to services, whether they are level 1 services, level 2 services, those are the people that are easier to engage with in a certain respect, rather than people who are not known to services, who live in nice houses and nice areas, and the kids go to nice schools, because those people have got so many more barriers in their place. And when you're talking about the ethnic factor in it as well, I think that's another interesting factor, because from our backgrounds, if you come from a South Asian background, the first people that you go to for help and support is your own community, is your own family, are your peers, and if those people are not able to reach out and give you the right help and support, you often will go back and live in that abusive relationship, because it's almost like, well, if maybe it's not my fault, maybe it's my fault, maybe it's not their fault, your partner's or your abuser's fault. Maybe if I change my behaviour, everything will be okay. So I think it's really key and really important that we educate the BME community, the South Asian community, in understanding what domestic abuse is. It's never the victim's fault, and making them sort of change their behaviour and become more amenable, it's not going to make the abuse stop. And really, the situation is that unless that perpetrator changes their behaviour, accesses help and support, nothing will change. And I think there are so many more barriers in place for South Asian victims. So when they reach out for help and support, obviously we take that very seriously. Often we see cases where it is domestic abuse, there's no other factor there, but often we see cases where there are forced marriage issues or honour-based abuse issues, and that sort of just heightens the risk and makes it more challenging more difficult really to provide the support. But nevertheless, we need to bring other agencies in to be able to do that safely. But yeah, it impacts people in all walks of life. Is the final message really.
Yeah, no, I agree with that, Shigufta. I think, when it talks about honour-based violence and those areas, it has no place, whether you're someone of faith or someone not of faith. There's no place for that in the community. So in terms of tolerance, there should be zero tolerance for that. But there are some, not acceptance, but I guess normalized comments that a man has a certain right in a relationship, or what will people think if I raise this? There's also fear of retaliation. So the questions about and if we're just using a more common example where the woman is the victim, because we have to also be mindful that men are also victims. Probably about 20% of the domestic violence cases in the UK is where men are actually the victims. But if we put that excuse, people will ask, why don't the women leave their partners? What seems to be driving that kind of behaviour?
There's lots of different factors. I mean, if you look at the BME community, a lot of that is what will people say, and it might be that you're married within the family, which adds other barriers because you're breaking the family up, not just your relationship. So there's those factors to look at, and it might just be that the fact that the victim genuinely loves that partner, even though it's hard to understand that how can you love somebody who's abusing you? If you speak to a victim, a lot of them will sort of say that it's because I love them, and often it can be because there are barriers in place like housing or children, and it's just the physicality of it. How do I move on from this relationship? What is there out there for me? What am I looking forward to? And what we've also seen, and this is really quite sad when you think about it, are older victims. So similarly to what I was talking about before about people with vulnerabilities who need caring, who are victims, who are relying on their carers, who are their abusers. We've also got people who've lived in that relationship for 50 years. They're in their 70s, 80s. That sort of control that you sort of talked about, Mehran, just now, what's sort of almost acceptable, because that's been the cultural norm, in the 50s and 60s, is what they've grown up with and what has been their normal life all their life. And now they realise that, they're in their 70s, 80s, and they've lived 50 years in an abusive relationship. Children have grown up and moved out. They've got grandchildren who are there. And they're at that point, they're thinking, well, what is the point of me leaving this now? Because what do I move on to? This is all I've ever lived with. So we often see victims who have been in that sort of situation, and it's really heartbreaking when you think that that's all they've lived with is an abusive relationship, and it's almost now too late for them to take that step. But it isn't, obviously. We would encourage anybody from any age to access help and support. It's never too late. But that could be a barrier as well. So there are many barriers for victims, really, if you think about this. So it's not as easy saying, why don't they just leave? There are lots of sort of factors to consider, and also the risk heightens. So at the point of leaving is when that victim is at the point of most risk. So again, we need people like Holly. You need that sort of advice and support, and you need a safety plan in place before you actually take that step of leaving, which is why refuges are important, because often they could be a safety gap for that person, a stopgap, where they can go and get those injunctions and those orders in place and then move back home safely. But we need to sort of plan that, and often, just saying to somebody, pack up your bags and go, is not the right advice to give. It needs to be done in a planned way, I would say, with safety advice in place.
Holly, coming to you, in terms of generically, if someone was thinking, they might think their friend is having some domestic abuse or something, what advice would you give as a legal professional to them to handle the situation?
Oh gosh, it completely depends on the type of what they think is going on exactly. Usually the first point would just be to speak to that, see if we can get a conversation going with that individual. But you have to handle it very, very carefully, because as we were just saying, they might not realise that they are a victim of domestic violence at that point. There might be many reasons why they don't want to leave, but it's a case of trying to have some sort of private conversation with them to assess the situation and just let them know what help is available, but also let them know that what is happening is illegal and isn't right, and they need assistance for it. Some people don't realise, but there is no minimum level of domestic violence before you can have a non-molestation order or contact the police or contact a charity. One minor incident is too many incidents. It doesn't have to have been something that's been going on for a very long time. It doesn't have to be incredibly serious. It can start very, very small, and more often than not, that then grows and increases over time. So the most important thing is, if someone comes to us and says, "I think my friend is struggling," or "I think somebody is suffering," it's a case of trying to have a conversation with them and just assess what's going on and letting them know exactly what's out there to help them.
Okay. And just going on that theme, in terms of marginalized communities that we mentioned earlier, obviously you're in the Manchester office, and just to give us some ideas of the urban setting, is there anything in terms of LGBT community, perhaps sex workers, drug users, people with insecure immigration status, to give a few examples? Can you give me, is there a caseload depending on what communities you serve or not?
Oh gosh. I mean, our caseload can cover anybody. There isn't a specific type of person that we work with or someone from a specific background. Domestic violence sufferers can be absolutely anybody. They can be someone you really don't expect. Most of the time it is regardless of age, it's regardless of background, gender, religion, sexuality, ethnicity, all these sorts of things. Usually you do find it is more often experienced by women than men, but men are still victims. Like there's absolutely no doubt about that. Yeah, so I mean, it's difficult to say. There isn't a particular community, or there are certainly certain areas where there are greater sufferers, but that doesn't rule out anybody at all.
So, Shigufta, if I come to you, what are the consequences of this kind of domestic violence? Because there's lots of information around impact on someone's mental health. Unfortunately, it leads to emotional dysregulation, sometimes to suicide, and we see women perhaps are more inclined to choose that route just because of the degree of helplessness that they find themselves in. What have you seen, and are there any kind of positive consequences that you've, from certain cases that they've had to oversee?
What's really interesting, Mehran, is that there's been so much training and awareness raising. I'm sure you'll have heard of it as well, with adverse childhood effects, so ACEs. Basically what we've seen is that if somebody has had an adverse childhood effect, so been impacted by domestic abuse when they've been growing up, or they've suffered losses of bereavements, families been in prison, those sort of things, they have an impact on you as you're growing up. And the impact of that when you're an adult also manifests itself in all sorts of different either physical symptoms or mental health and emotional symptoms. So we know that domestic abuse has a huge impact on somebody's well-being, whether it's emotional or physical. But in relation to the cases that we see a whole plethora of cases, as Holly was sort of saying. It's not just one type of person that we see. So we've seen cases of coercive control. And increasingly we're seeing cases of stalking and harassment. We've seen cases where somebody's been, the debt's been taken out in the victim's name, so they end up with a huge amount of debt in their name, which they can't do anything about because the documents have been signed by them or they've been forged by the part perpetrator, but basically the debt is in their name and they're stuck with that debt. So all of those things are going to have a huge emotional impact on that person. And often people will take on, they will self-harm or have suicidal ideation because they are so, I think you're backed into a corner. You're almost like, what do I do with this situation now? Because there isn't a way out of it. Way out of it for me is to end my life or self-harm as a way of dealing with it. But self-harm isn't just cutting yourself. Self-harm could be that you're drinking, that you're taking drugs, and those sort of has an impact on you, which sort of excludes you from services. So if you are taking substances, drugs or alcohol, yourself or your partner's forcing you to take drugs and alcohol, you are going to be less likely to be able to access refuge support, because refuges will be reluctant to take you in communal living with those sort of issues. So you add more barriers to your way out of that situation. So those are the kind of people that we work with as well. And that's quite challenging to sort of find avenues for them to access help and support. But the successes, honestly, that's what keeps you going in this job, because if everything was doom and gloom, we would all be having a nervous breakdown every day. So the successes are when you see somebody building their lives, whether it's people in our refuge, when they settle in, because when they first come, they're very traumatized, but when they settle in and they start thinking, this is not as bad as I imagined it to be. It's not a hostel. It's a nice place. I've got nice food. I've got nice furniture. I've got support workers over here to help and support me. So, you can see people rebuilding their lives. And similarly at our centre, when we see the difference that we make to somebody because they've engaged with the support that we've given them, they've taken out an injunction, they've got the child contact sorted, and they're building their life again. They've got debts, but they've got a debt plan in place that they're following. And so it's small steps sometimes, but all of those small steps sort of add up to something quite significant. And that's what I think makes us want to do our job every day, because otherwise, it's very disheartening at times, and it's very depressing. But it's those moments that sort of lift you and think, well, actually, I made a difference to this person's life. Today's been a good day.
That's good. And Holly, I couldn't let you go tonight without telling us a little bit about Clare's Law. So there's a domestic victim, isn't there, a disclosure scheme? Could you tell the audience a little bit about, if you want to find out if a partner of yours has been doing any abuse? I think the members of the public can find this out. Is that right?
Yeah, it's been made public now. Bear with me, I'm trying to get. So if you are, say, you've met somebody new, or you think there's somebody in your life, or you've met someone and you want to find out whether they've got a history of domestic violence, you can now contact. I'm just checking who it is that you go to.
It's just the police, Holly. Sort of 101 is something that we sort of support victims with a lot. So I can. Yeah,
it's just you make an application for disclosure about that person to find out whether you're in risk, and it's confidential. They won't know that you've made the application, but any member of the public can do it. And it's basically, if you've got a partner, or it can be a family or a friend whose partner you want to make the inquiry about. So it's not the same as a criminal record check, but it does provide you information about that person, which otherwise you might not have. It's very important.
And you touched upon the concept of confidentiality, and that's obviously important to you as a legal person. Can you tell maybe the audience a little bit about when would you break confidentiality in the cases you come across? And it's not a full given, is it, confidentiality when you deal with the cases?
No, it's we stick to it. It is generally, everything is confidential. But if we think someone's at risk of harm and we do need to contact the police, or we do need to contact a charity, or even we need to speak to somebody's GP, then there are times when confidentiality can be breached. It's a case of weighing up whether the risk of harm justifies it, and is that person safe. So I think the main one, obviously, is if you need to phone the police and breach that confidentiality, and get somebody perhaps out of the house, or get some sort of support.
I think as clinicians, Fahim, and because this is obviously it's an emerging topic, but it's a topic that we have to cover as clinicians. I'm obviously a psychiatrist, Fahim's a GP. We have slightly different time frames to do our assessment, but things present in different ways, don't they? And what I do find is there is a pattern that someone will have had contact with, whether it's someone from public services, or there'll be another relative who presents with something slightly odd, very much withdrawn, change in personality, or unexplained bruising, or very much kind of personalizing it, making themselves feel that they're the wrong person in that relationship. So there are some kind of features that perhaps listeners should be mindful of. I don't know I'll give this open to both yourself, Shigufta, and Holly, whether this is something that you feel is the case.
Yeah, we consider quite a sort of a wide list of spotting the signs. So, if someone comes to us and they've got a partner who's very jealous and possessive, maybe they're charming one minute and then really evasive the next, or abusive the next minute. If someone perhaps says, oh, he tells me what to wear, where to go, who to see, or even just puts them down on a regular basis. I think the main one that's quite tricky is when it's mind games and it makes them doubt their own judgment. That becomes a point of when it's gaslighting, where someone doesn't even believe that they're in mind and what they think. Perhaps, bruises are a very, very obvious one, and if there's any physical marks, but it's when it becomes all the emotional signs that you have to spot. So usually that is showing a change in behaviour in someone. So it's, especially if you've known someone a long time and perhaps there's been a change in the way they act, or are they communicating with you less? These are all sorts of things to look out for, I think.
Shigufta,
yeah, I would agree. I would agree with what Holly's saying, that if you see a change in behaviour in somebody that so it's a friend or a family member, it's okay to ask them the question. And I think sometimes people sort of think that this is something which is a taboo subject, and if we ask somebody, they might get offended, or we might say something which is wrong. But if you see a change in somebody's behaviour, just ask them the question: are you okay? Is there anything I can do to help? Listen to them, believe them, support them, give them the right points of access to help and support, signpost them to where they can go for help and support. And I think that's really, really crucial. And I would say that, if you're a neighbour, because often people sort of feel that, I don't want to get involved, I don't want to fall out with my neighbour. But if you hear something going on next door, which is causing you alarm or causing you worry, then pick up the phone and get help and support, because they will thank you for it in the long run. They might not do it immediately, but in the long run they will. So I think people just need to look out for each other, is what I would say with that.
Yeah, the big question kind of on everyone's lips at the moment is, how are you? I think that's been quite prominent during lockdown, is we're asking people, how are you? And we actually mean it. It's not just you're flippant, how are you doing? It's, how are you? Like, is everything okay? Talk to me. And we keep asking that question.
And I think a lot of that, Holly, is because of people's mental and well-being, isn't it? But you can sort of apply that to domestic abuse as well. When you ask that question, people are actually meaning it.
Holly, in terms of obviously coming back to barriers to what may prevent women or men seeking legal support, just thinking out loud, things that could perhaps they might think of, it's like, oh, I'll have to face my perpetrator in court, or I won't win, and all of these sort of things. Can you give us some ideas to try and dispel those myths so that more people come forward if they're a victim?
Yeah, people worry all the time. Oh, I don't want to have to go through it all again and discuss it all. I don't want to have to explain myself or talk about what's happened. I just want to get over it and move on. Or, I don't want to have to come up against him and see him in court. Well, at the moment, I mean, the best way to get over something is to talk about it and get help and have support from other people, and not just keep these problems to yourself and try and cope with them yourself. But these protective injunctions and legal assistance is there for a reason. And the courts, at the moment, all court hearings are being done by telephone. So, and you can also have representation. So the victim will not have to speak. They won't have to, at first hearing, they don't have to say anything. They can just be on the call. Their solicitor or barrister will do all the talking for them and act for them, and the judge will speak to them. Their solicitor will do all the email correspondence and anything else like that on their behalf. So again, they don't have to deal with the perpetrator at all. They can be completely removed from the situation. But then when lockdown ends and we do go back to court, the courts will always have in the application form, do you need separate waiting rooms? Do you need sections between you so that you don't have to see the other person when you are in the courtroom? There are so many different levels. Do you need separate bathrooms to ensure that you're not crossing each other when you both go to the bathroom and have the hearing or anything like that? There are so many different things that can be put in place to make sure that they don't have to actually come into contact or have to speak in any way. And the other one people often worry about is, oh, well, I don't want to act on this because what if it affects my children? What if we go to court over this and then neither of us get to the children again, or the children find out about what's been happening? But again, it's always in the best interest of the children, again, to ensure that everything has been sorted out through the courts. The courts will make all the right inquiries. They will speak with social services. They have their own advisory service called CAFCAS. So it's the Court and Family Advisory Support Service, who will do background checks on everybody. They will speak to both parties individually on the telephone, so they don't have to be together at the same time. And the court make all the right inquiries that they need to ensure that everyone's protected, everyone's safe. And if there are any safeguarding and welfare issues, the court has to be made aware very, very early on. And that's the main thing. And that the same would happen in children proceedings anyway. So people should never feel they are held back by worrying about their children, or held back because they're worried about having to face their perpetrator. There are so many protections that we can put in place, and they will always be, their safety will always come first.
Excellent. I'm noticing the time. We just have 5 minutes to go, and we like to finish our shows with 3 top tips that our guests can provide as to perhaps for the audience and listener, maybe if they came halfway through, or just so they can take home as to what they've learned or actually should moving forward if they know someone with domestic violence. If I come to you, Shigufta, please, if this, from your wide, vast experience of tackling domestic violence and for many years, I mean, what 3 things would you want to embed into someone's mind about this topic that they can take home tonight?
So if you're a perpetrator, get help and support, because at the end of the day, everybody's capable of change. Everybody's capable of changing their behavior. And surely you want to have a relationship which is meaningful, and which obviously your partner's not wanting to leave you, and get help and support. So contact services for help and support. For victims, we've not mentioned it today, but one of the key tips around safety for victims is if you are suffering domestic abuse and it's not safe for you to talk, there's a silent call system. And I just wanted to highlight that. So if you ring 999, you don't speak because you can't speak, the operator will prompt you and ask you questions, and you need to at that point press 55 on your phone, which alerts the operator that this is not a hoax call, it's actually a call for emergency help. So if you don't press 55, then they will just think it's a hoax call and the line will go dead. So the 55 silent call, I think, is a really key message for victims to take. And then just when the operator is prompting you, you can respond through your phone keypad, because they will prompt you to do that. But remember the 55 when you're asked the question that do you need help and support. And then I think my third key message is for services, I think. So if you are somebody who works in a service like yourselves, you could help professionals, or any other officer, in whether they're working in housing or health or education, who is listening today, is that you can access online training on domestic abuse. All the local safeguarding boards have online training. So if you can't access face-to-face training from somebody like myself, then please access online training, and just get the basic education on domestic abuse, because I think the more people that understand about it, the better able we all are as a society to help victims.
Excellent. And same to you, Holly. You've had the benefit of a few minutes thinking time there as well. Anything for the audience to take your top tips on this topic, and maybe from a legal perspective as well?
Yeah, so I think the main one is just to appreciate the fact that domestic violence and domestic abuse take so many forms. People should never feel that they're not a victim, or they're worried that they don't classify under it. They should always seek help if they're ever worried in the slightest about themselves or anybody else. The second one is obviously we're in the middle of a lockdown in the UK, and hopefully, I mean, it might be lifting soon and people are going to start moving, but people need to be aware that despite the government guidelines, if they are a victim of domestic violence or a perpetrator, those guidelines do not apply. They can still leave the family home. They can still go and live with friends and family, or go and find help at a shelter or with a charity or whoever it may be. And solicitors are still working and still able to assist at all times at the moment. Third point is just, look out for your friends and family. Keep an eye on everybody, and if you see any changes in behaviour or anyone you're worried about, speak to them, but also speak to charity, speak to a solicitor, and get some assistance from a professional.
No, that's great, both Holly and Shigufta. I think you've summarised the salient points very well. I think from my perspective, and I guess from Team Med Talks, and I must say that we did have some more comments coming in. So for those, Shig, thank you very much for listening into our show. The 3 things I'd like to say is you're not alone. It's not your fault, and help is available. So if you feel that there are barriers in the way some services are structured, especially if you're from a BME kind of background, then there are translating services or other interpreters available. So always kind of ask for that service. So I'd just like to thank again Holly and Shigufta for sharing their valuable time on a Tuesday evening. It's been great having you both on. And we do have a stellar lineup for next week because we've got Dr. Sarah Sebastian. So we'll be discussing things to do with substance misuse as well as addictions. So again, this is another quite topical area, which is unfortunately being having focus on given the current lockdown restrictions. Any final comments for him?
No, I think you summed it up. I think we could have talked to both of you for much longer, but alas, we're always against time. So really big thanks, Shigufta and Holly, for both of your times. And hopefully maybe we can have you back on another show in the future, and it'd be really good. I think, Shigufta, there are other topics that you could perhaps talk about, and Holly, as well as a family lawyer, I'm sure there's other topics as well. So a big thank you from Med Talks, and I wish everyone a good evening, and I hope you can all join us again next Tuesday evening, 8 to 9 p.m. For another radio show. Thank you so much. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.